So if I ask you to think about a successful athlete or a performer, who or what comes to mind? A Hall of Fame athlete, perhaps, a champion, a business mogul, or an award-winning teacher. It's easy to think of success and imagine lifting a trophy, getting a medal around your neck, getting a plaque on the wall. We're actually wired to think that way because those things are exciting, they're flashy, and they often make the headlines. As a society, this is often the perspective that we use. We think of a performance like an Olympic final, a job interview, a business proposal as just that, a performance, an opportunity to do something great, to achieve peak performance, to hit the shot you're supposed to be able to hit, to run the race at the speed you're supposed to be able to reach. But what if I told you that those big moments are actually due to small, seemingly insignificant factors, not the flashy that we automatically think about? What if I told you that those are the true key pieces to success? Because the truth is, if you talk to any elite level performer, whether it's an athlete or a non-athlete, they'll probably tell you that any big performance is nothing more than an event made up of hundreds, thousands of tiny little pieces meticulously placed together to create something bold and beautiful. It's the end result of everything that's come before it, the good, the bad, and everything in between. So that's what we're here to do today. We're here to talk a little bit about success, how we define it, and possibly even challenge that traditional view of what it is. Because before we can help performers achieve peak performance and succeed, it's important for us to help them define what success means to them. I have the pleasure of working as a performance psychology specialist. My job focuses on helping elite performers, athletes and non-athletes, achieve peak performance by helping them harness that mental acuity. Surgeons, athletes, musicians, corporate leaders, and even performance artists. So if I were to ask everyone in the room here to think about a moment or think about an event that you commonly participate in. Now, this could obviously be a sport, but it could also be parenting, teaching, giving a recorded lecture on a well-known platform to potentially thousands of people. And think about that event and consider, what does success mean for you? Because when we talk about helping those performers, we sometimes help them build mental skills. And that, a lot goes into that. That is a very big spectrum, a wide spectrum. But in addition to those things, we can also help people unearth and overcome various mental blocks. So to you, think about what success means in the activities that you normally engage in. And so the teacher in me is really trying to resist the urge to ask all of you to share your ideas to see if we can come up with some form of cohesive definition of what it means to be successful. And so, time permitting, we would obviously do that. But I suspect if we were to do this, we would probably have some similarities amongst our responses, with maybe some subtle differences. Chances are, if we opened it up to the group, we would find that most of us would define success as winning, right? Outcomes. We call these outcomes. And I recognize that not everybody in the room is an elite level athlete. That's fine. Because if we think about performance as a more all-inclusive concept, it starts to make a little bit more sense. Humans, whatever context that they're in, perform, right? We give lectures, we take exams, we interview for jobs, we audition for roles, we network, we compete for clients and business, we perform. So in the context of outcomes, what this means is landing that job, getting cast in the play, finishing at the top of your class in that exam. Now, obviously this is important, but in my opinion, it's incomplete. It's narrow, right? Because overall, all this does is it illustrates when you are performing better than a competitor. So not a true measure of your ability at all, just how you did in that moment compared to that person this one time. And so this matters, obviously, in society and in sport. We all want those trophies. We all desire to finish first because it's meaningful. And there's nothing wrong with that. Never in my career have I ever encouraged somebody to stop wanting or trying to win. But I have cautioned them about overemphasizing this idea of success. Because when we overemphasize that, we can get into some slippery trouble, and we're going to talk about some of those things. The truth of the matter is that some of the earliest research in social psychology was actually interested in finding out what happens when we behave, or in other words, perform with other people. They coined terms like social facilitation and social inhibition. Does the presence of others actually lift us up and make us perform better? Or does it help us recoil a little bit and perform more poorly? And so what this left us with is this idea of maybe this is incomplete. Should we expand this framework? And I'm by no means the first person to ever do this, by the way. Some of the great leaders and thinkers of generations before me have challenged this traditional view of success in saying that it's not just winning. It's not just finishing at the top of the podium. Should it involve something a little bit more personal? Should it involve something that has to do with our skill set and our abilities, as opposed to constantly looking across the aisle and figuring out, am I outperforming another person? So this leads us to this second kind of layer that we have, which is performance. And so performance illustrates how an individual is doing based on their skill set, based on their growth, based on their development, based on their resources. It allows them to look inside as opposed to over there. So it's saying, did you perform well, not did you perform better than? And it looks at over time. Are you better today than you were yesterday? So some common examples that we might think about in society, right? Did a person getting a grade back on an exam, for example, and feeling really happy with their performance even though they didn't finish at the top of their class. In fact, even if they finish last. Or walking out of an audition feeling very proud of the performance that you gave, despite the fact that you didn't get cast in that role. So it's okay to have pride in those moments, despite the fact that you didn't outperform another person. And in fact, it can be a pretty lonely and maybe an uphill battle. It's almost like swimming upstream to be purely performance-oriented. Why? Because there are very few trophies given for the hardest worker, for the one who tried their best. And so we want the flashy things, but we also want that self-satisfaction. So it's a constant battle back and forth. And also, outcomes are really hard to come by. They're never guaranteed. Sometimes the other team or the other athlete is just better. And that sucks, but that doesn't take away from what you gave. The final layer, the third and final layer that we want to talk about here today is the process. The process represents the tiny little boxes that you need to check along the way in order to achieve the performance. From an athlete perspective, this is their strength and conditioning, their sleep, their nutrition, their coachability, the communication that they have with their coach, their leadership skills, the way they take care of their body, their tactical and technical skills. Essentially what we're talking about here is the fundamentals, right? When I started graduate school, my cohort and I, during our third year, were told that we were going to go and sit for our comprehensive exams. And so anybody here listening or watching with a PhD probably had a visceral reaction to that term. So essentially, we were tested on everything we had learned up until that point in our third year. And I remember sitting down with my mentors when I first stepped on campus about a week in, and they told me that studying begins on day one. And they didn't mean go home, crack open the books, and start memorizing stuff. What they were trying to illustrate to me and trying to share with me is that the students who performed best on this exam were the ones that valued every discussion, every class, every reading, every meeting, and every piece of research that they read. I was a competitive athlete my entire life. I enter non-competitive situations wanting to do better than other people. It was just part of who I was. And so it was in that moment that I really noticed a shift a shift from wanting to outperform my peers, even if it was not a competitive setting, to all of a sudden wanting to do well on this exam because it meant that I understood the material. By understanding the material, I would be performing better on this exam. And by performing better on this exam, it means that I was better prepared to be a qualified professional and contributor in our field. So what this did is it emphasized effort, focus, and consistent execution over time. And what ended up happening is what we see in sport. The more we are focusing on the process, the more the performances occur. The higher level of our performance, the increased likelihood that the outcome happens. And so even though we all want that shiny object at the end, what we really need to do is think back down to figure out what are the elements, the small little intangible things that we need to do to eventually get there. Now, another demonstration of this is the story of the three little pigs. We're all familiar with this, so I'm not going to spend time talking about it. But if we think about that story and consider if success was defined based on which pig finished their house first, the first pig is the obvious winner. Right? For kids, this is all about not cutting corners and doing things the right way. But in the context of performance and success that we're talking about right now, we can think about this as the value of every brick the third pig laid to build a foundation that would stand the test of time. So when we think about success as an all-encompassing concept, okay, I tend to view this as a circle. Our mindset, how we define success, is a circle. And given that we talked about three different concepts, it makes sense for us to think, oh, they're evenly divided amongst them. But I think this is the problem that a lot of people get into, is when presented with this idea, they often assume, okay, I need to be completely process-oriented. I need to let go of the outcome, not worry about winning or losing, and just focus on doing the little things. That's not how it works. Because the truth is, it's not a good, better, or best. Even though one leads to the other, it doesn't mean that one is more important than the other, because we need all three. And so what we have eventually is, let's consider this athlete who's going up, let's say, an Olympic final or a Final Four game. Their mindset may look a little bit like this. They want to win so badly, and their view of whether or not they succeeded is going to be dictated based on that outcome. That's okay, right? That same athlete a couple weeks prior may look like this because they're in practice, they're having individual training, they're working with their colleagues or their teammates and coaches and things like that. For this athlete, it's important for them to identify what the balance looks like. Now finally, once we understand this structure, once I present this idea to athletes, we eventually get into this conversation of like, okay, I understand what that means, but now what? So the first question I encourage athletes to ask themselves is what I'm doing, is my current framework working for me in terms of helping me reach my potential on a more consistent basis, whatever that is, whatever context that I'm in? And whether it is or isn't, the second question is usually, what is my ideal formula? What does my circle need to look like? Am I a more orange versus blue versus green? What structure do I need in various circumstances? And then finally, and this is where individuals like myself come in, is helping them get there. So what does it look like? What does it need to look like? And how do I eventually get there? Now, important in this discussion is also the idea of why. Why is this so? And again, I'm not standing here preaching a process-oriented mindset. What I'm talking about here is acknowledging the value of balance. Finding balance within yourself, given the circumstances and context that you're in. And so one of the things that we find when we have a balanced approach is that we develop more resilient athletes, more resilient performers. In sport and in life, setbacks are going to happen. People are going to get injured, coaches are going to get fired, people are going to get traded, the environment is going to change, altering your approach to it. Now, the individuals that have a more balanced approach are the ones that are able to look at those setbacks and really consider them more as stepping stones as opposed to roadblocks. It allows them to think past that and consider the lesson that they're learning by going through this process. The second thing it fosters is mental well-being. Individuals with a more balanced mindset, what we find is that they have decreased anxiety, decreased stress level, decreased frustration. They're less likely to burn out. They're less likely to, or they're more likely to remain motivated through an event. And finally, we've talked a lot about the performance, the individual. But what about the team? What about the coaches, the leaders, the teachers, the parents, the ones that cultivate the environment, the ones that create the culture? We tend to find that coaches and leaders who create a culture that foster balance by infusing process orientation with performance and outcome tend to create environments where there's more psychological safety. Athletes and kids and learners and performers are more likely to try even though they may not see success right away. And so it's not just for the elite performers. We have to think of this in the greater context of our youth as well. Because developing that over time will mean that it is going to be that look like that for the rest of their lives. So I'm going to leave you with this. The process is not the journey. It creates the foundation for the destination. And at the risk of throwing yet another metaphor and image to kind of help illustrate my point, I'm going to do it anyway. The next time you perform or you're watching a performance, here's what I want you to do. I want you to picture an iceberg. And this is something that we in the performance psychology world use quite a bit. Because the performance is but a glimpse, a small portion of something greater. When you look at an iceberg, you see the tip. You see a small proportion of what's actually happening under the water. But the truth is, without what's happening beneath the surface, the tip sinks. Without what you see, what you don't see behind the scenes, the actual performance that's supposed to happen on camera in that Olympic final, that 10 seconds it takes from somebody to go from the starting blocks to the finish line, doesn't actually exist. So, big performances are a compilation of tiny pieces. Embrace the process, trust the work, find balance, and let the results speak for themselves. Thank you.